Why is she smiling? That is the key question that we are trying to address here, and which historians, of course, have been asking that question for centuries. Why is the Mona Lisa smiling? And this may come as a surprise to you, but the Mona Lisa, though it is perhaps the most famous painting in the world, we know very little about it. She is really shrouded in mystery. And the reason is, for one, that Leonardo never dated his work, never signed his work, never titled his work, which of course has cultivated a sense of mystique around the Mona Lisa painting. Now, part of that was, I think, deliberate, because Leonardo lived in a time when artists were trying to work their way up from the social position that they had in the Middle Ages as artisans in dirty smocks. And they wanted to be seen as poets. As Alberti, the famous author of the 15th century, wrote, ut pictura poesis. So the poet, so thus also the artist. And so by endowing his paintings with a certain mysteriousness, with a certain mystique, with a certain allegorical meaning that is not immediately obvious, Leonardo tried to give his painting that poetic significance that he was striving for. And that, of course, is the reason why there is so much mystery about his paintings. Now, of course, the real reason why so much about the Mona Lisa is mysterious is because nobody can agree why it was painted, who it represents, and when it was painted. And that, of course, has spawned a whole series of books over the last couple of decades with many, many different theories. And the reason is that even the eyewitnesses who were there in the 16th century don't always agree. For example, just in the last few years of Leonardo's life, when he was living in a chateau in Amboise, given to him by the French king, King François Ier, a Cardinal d'Aragon, visited him at his chateau, and he was accompanied by his secretary, named Antonio de Beatis. And we are very fortunate that the secretary copied everything that the cardinal saw at that time. And what the cardinal saw were three paintings: the Mona Lisa, the Saint Anne, and the Saint John the Baptist. For some reason, Leonardo had not delivered these three works to the people who obviously paid for them, had kept them with him and taken across the Alps to his final retirement place in France. Of course, that's where the question begins. What is so significant about the Mona Lisa, the Saint Anne, and the Saint John? Is there some sort of a programmatic relationship between the three? And can they help us to understand what the Mona Lisa is really about? Now, De Beatis wrote something very interesting in his notebook. He said that the Mona Lisa, he called it a portrait of a certain Florentine lady, was done at the request of the magnificent Giuliano de' Medici. Now, Giuliano de' Medici at the time was the brother of Pope Leo X, a Medici, in other words, who had died just a few years earlier. But this would place the Mona Lisa very near the end of Leonardo's career. We're talking somewhere between 1513 and 1515 when Leonardo was in Rome. But then we have this particular individual. His name is Giorgio Vasari, and he wrote a book about the artists of the great Renaissance in Florence, the Quattrocento, around 1640, even though he started writing it earlier. And he says something entirely different. He says that Leonardo undertook to execute for Francesco del Giocondo the portrait of Mona Lisa, his wife. Monna is the contraction of the Italian word Madonna. So as she was married, she was referred to as Mrs. Giocondo, hence Mona Lisa Giocondo. So here we have two entirely contradictory discussions about the origins of the Mona Lisa, right as eyewitnesses. So you can imagine what happened since then. We also have a receipt from the estate, which suggests that Leonardo's longtime companion, perhaps lover, Salai, had a painting called La Honda, which some people believe is La Gioconda, in his possession in Milan in the 1520s. And then there is other records that suggest that no, the Mona Lisa at the time was in the collection of King Francis I of France after Leonardo died in his retirement home, given to him by the king. Naturally, the king inherited that particular painting. So there is mass confusion about the origins and the dating. Not only is there mass confusion on that, Vasari gives us a very detailed description of the Mona Lisa. And he says not only that he painted the Mona Lisa for Francesco del Giocondo, for his wife, but after toiling it for over 4 years, he left it unfinished. Now, I don't know about you, but if you look at the Mona Lisa, and we have a replica right there, if there is one painting done by Leonardo that is finished as it will ever be, it is the Mona Lisa. So why would Vasari refer to it as an unfinished painting? Not only that, but he describes the rosy and pearly tints, the beautiful eyelashes, the eyebrows, painted with great subtlety. Now, I don't know about you, but if you can see any pink in this portrait, you're good. If you can see any eyelashes or eyebrows, please tell me where they are. So the mystery is truly telling. And as an art historian, I should also point out that if indeed the Mona Lisa was painted for Francesco del Giocondo early in Leonardo's career, we're talking about 1502, 1503, this is a painting from the earlier part of his career. This is the Madonna of the Yarn Winder that he was working on when he received the commission from Francesco del Giocondo, according to Vasari. And you compare that to his late work, the Mona Lisa of the latter part, you can see the difference just in terms of stylistic treatment. The sfumato, the dark, smoky coloring, so typical of the Mona Lisa, is nowhere in evidence that early in his career. So there is mass confusion, and over the last 30, 40 years, some of the top scholars on Leonardo have seized on that confusion to suggest she is not really the wife of Giocondo. She is not really associated with Florence, because some claim, no, she's Isabella d'Este, Marquess of Mantua, who was the leading patroness of art in Leonardo's lifetime. Others believe, well, since she is associated with Giuliano de' Medici, maybe she was his mistress. Why not? Pacifica Brandano. Others again suggest that perhaps she was the Duchess of Francavilla, Constanza d'Avalos. So it goes on and on and on. And there are some other questions too. For example, why did Leonardo, who walked away from a portrait commission from that same Isabella d'Este, who was one of the wealthiest patronesses of art in Renaissance Italy, why did he walk away from a portrait commission from her and instead accepted a commission to paint a Florentine housewife? What's up with that? And finally, why did he agree to paint a portrait at all when he's on record of saying, just around that same time, that he doesn't want to do any more paintings, he wants to devote himself to engineering and to science? Well, here is the answer that Chris and I came up with. All of these contradictory sources exist. All of this conflicting information exists because these people are not talking about the same painting. It's that simple. That's why we have these egregious differences. They're not talking about the same painting because we believe Leonardo painted two versions of the Mona Lisa. One in 1503 and the one after 1508. Now, I know for some of you that may be quite shocking and a rather radical suggestion, but it is not as radical as you might think when you consider that Leonardo painted many other duplicate works. For example, and these are just two examples, the Madonna of the Yarn Winder, you can see they're very close copies, and the Virgin of the Rocks, both painted by Leonardo with his assistants. And the reason is that Leonardo painted very few original works. He painted very few original works compared to the output of his contemporaries, who would typically have 2, 3, 4 paintings leaving their workshop on an annual basis. To compensate for that, he had his assistants, under his supervision, create copies of his works while he was painting them himself. That was his raison d'être. Now, a very important discovery was made in 2005 when a professor at Heidelberg University was browsing through the books in the university library in preparation for an exhibit, and he came upon this little annotation. You can see it's sort of handwritten, as we all do, doodling in a book. And this particular individual, in this case, it was a 16th century person called Agostino Vespucci, a secretary of someone that I'm sure you're familiar with, Machiavelli. He was reading this book in Latin called The Letters of Cicero to His Friends, and he came across a reference in this particular book to Apelles. Apelles is a Greek artist who, like Leonardo, sometimes left his work unfinished. And when Vespucci read this particular situation, when he read that Apelles left works unfinished, he took his pen and he wrote there, gee, that reminds me, that's exactly the way Leonardo works in all of his paintings. For example, and I'm quoting, the portrait of Lisa del Giocondo and the Mother of the Virgin, and we're going to see what he does with the Chamber of the Great Council, the fresco that he has just come to terms with the Gonfaloniere Soderini. And then he dates it, October 1503. Now, this little scribble in this little book that was discovered in 2005 has wiped away 40 years of Leonardo scholarship. Because what it tells us, that little scribble, is A, the Mona Lisa that we're talking about was painted in 1503. 2, it is the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. And 3, and this is very important, Vespucci makes a direct connection between the Mona Lisa and the fresco that Leonardo was about to paint in the great hall of the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence, namely in the great chamber of the Grand Council. And so now the pieces start to fit. And what we try to do in our book is now create a chronology about how the Mona Lisa came about based on these very new, intriguing pieces of evidence. And for us, it starts with this man. This is Machiavelli. I'm sure you've all heard of him. He was the author of the book The Prince, which came out in the 16th century and has influenced autocrats ever since. But at the time, Machiavelli was the secretary of the president of the Florentine Republic, the man named Soderini. And Machiavelli knew that the president of the city-state of Florence wanted a big fresco, a big patriotic fresco of the Battle of Anghiari. Why did they want that? Well, they were in a war with Pisa at the time, and the war was not going very well. Thank you very much. And the citizens of Florence were rumbling that the war was taking too long, it was depleting the treasury. So Soderini wanted to have a big patriotic propaganda piece painted in the great hall of the city hall. And he wanted Michelangelo to paint it. And the subject would be the Battle of Anghiari, because I don't know if you know much about the military history of Florence, but it probably would fit on a matchbox. I mean, they had a knack for getting defeated, except for the Battle of Anghiari, where for once they were victorious over the forces of Milan. Machiavelli knew about this commission. Machiavelli and Leonardo met while they were traveling together in the company of a rather unseemly person called Cesare Borgia. You'll know about him, of course, from the recent Showtime series. And Machiavelli wanted to help Leonardo. And Machiavelli told Leonardo, I can get you, you should apply, you should try to get that job. You should paint that big fresco because you know how to make frescoes based on the Last Supper in Milan. And Leonardo said, but I don't know anyone. Besides, I've done 2 pieces in Florence, and they both left them unfinished, so I'm not necessarily a popular guy around here. And then Machiavelli said, I know, you should talk. Here's that great hall. Of course, it was redecorated in the 1640s. So this is what you see today of that grand hall in what is now known as the Palazzo Vecchio. It was then known as the Palazzo della Signoria in the heart of Florence. And the fresco that Leonardo was going to paint would be around here right now. But Leonardo said, I don't know anyone. How can I convince Confaloniere, Soderini to not appoint Michelangelo, but to appoint me? And we believe that Machiavelli said, you need to talk to this guy. This guy, Francesco del Giocondo. And why is that? Because Francesco del Giocondo served on the Council del Dodici Buonomini, which in Italian means the Council of the 12 Good Men, who controlled policy in Florence at this time. In other words, this man had a Rolodex full of people throughout the Council of Florence, and he could pull strings necessary to get Leonardo the contract over the will of Soderini instead of Michelangelo. But Giocondo, who was a tough negotiator, we have records from the Florentine police where people complained about his ruthless tactics. This was not a very nice person. He drove a hard bargain. He said, I will get you the contract to do the great fresco in the Palazzo della Signoria on one condition. And Leonardo said, what? He says, make me a portrait of my wife. Just a small portrait. She's beautiful. It will take you a few months. If you do that, I will get you that fresco. And so it came to pass. Leonardo began to work on the portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, but after he, as we heard just from Vespucci, after he had finished the head and the hands, he got so absorbed with painting this great fresco of the Battle of Anghiari that the poor Mona Lisa portrait sat unfinished. And you might say, well, where is that unfinished work? Until September 27, 2012, we didn't know where it was. But on that date, a foundation in Switzerland announced that they were going to, for the first time in 40 years, make this painting once again available to the public. And here she is. This painting, and you see a replica over there, is what we believe is that first original, or as scholarship refers to it, the earlier version of the Mona Lisa. The earlier version of the Mona Lisa. And it's interesting because it was, I will tell you a little bit more about its history. It was only discovered in the house of a British nobleman in Somerset in 1913. The man was called Hugh Blaker. That was referred to as the Isleworth Mona Lisa because Hugh Blaker had a gallery in Isleworth, which is a suburb of London, as you may know. It was then acquired by the publisher Henry Pulitzer, I'm sure you've heard of that name, in 1962, and subsequently disappeared from view. And the poor lady, this beautiful lady, has been suffering in the cold steel of Swiss vaults ever since, which means that as we saw this great surge in Leonardo's scholarship after World War II, led by Kenneth Clark, when a whole wave of new scholarship was devoted to Leonardo and to the Mona Lisa, this poor lady was locked in a vault, and all of the wonderful tests and new digital techniques that we used on the Louvre Mona Lisa and all the other wonderful Leonardo paintings was never done on this lady until she emerged from obscurity in just a little less than a year ago. And here they are. And right away, I hope you can see that this is truly, the earlier version, is truly the likeness of a real human being. This is not an allegorical portrait. This is, you can imagine, that is a real, breathing young woman who, by the way, has just given birth. Now, hang on to that information. It's going to be very important to our story. When Leonardo painted Lisa del Giocondo in this earlier version, she was still recovering from the birth of a boy called Andrea. It was their fourth child, 3 from her, 1 from an earlier marriage. And I think the wonderful glow that a new mother exudes is readily visible in this painting. Okay, you might say, this is great. By the way, at the invitation of the foundation, we visited the real, this is a picture taken in the vault in, I cannot disclose the city, but it is in Switzerland. And I must tell you, we were just blown away by seeing this beautiful portrait up close, because it has been in a vault for all these years, which has been terrible because scholarship has been deprived of her. But by the same token, she has not been exposed to the atmospheric impact that the other lady in the Louvre has been. And so you can see, when you see right now in both works, the reproduction we have right there is taken after the recent restoration. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You can readily see how pristine she is, how beautiful she is. And we hope, and the foundation who is responsible for this painting will make an announcement soon that they are working on a worldwide tour. And I cannot say anything more about that, but hopefully soon we will hear about an announcement from the Mona Lisa Foundation that hopefully this lady will finally go on a public tour and receive the adulation that she so clearly deserves. And looking at that, now the description of Vasari is to a T. The rosy and pearly tints, the eyebrow curve, the nose, and the red of the lips. Now, this is a description that matches this portrait to a T. Now, if we needed any more evidence, I don't think we do, but if we needed any more evidence, young Raphael, I'm sure you've heard of the artist Raphael, happened to visit the workshop, or the workshop of the Bottega of Leonardo in 1504, as many young artists would do. They would go and visit the great masters, hang around, say, hey dude, what you're working on? Make some copies, and then move on to pursue their career. Raphael was in Leonardo's workshop in Florence in 1504 when he doodled this sketch of the Mona Lisa that was then being painted by Leonardo and his assistants. And right away you see the obvious similarity. There are two columns very prominently located on either side of the Mona Lisa, which screen the loggia behind which she is placed. Those same columns we see right there in the drawing made by Raphael. They do not appear in the Louvre portrait except just for a little bit of the pediment on the bottom of those columns. Look at the position of the horizon. The position of the horizon, the Rocky Mountain landscape right there, is identical to the position of the horizon in Raphael's drawing, unlike the horizon on the Louvre drawing, painting, which is much, much higher, as you can see with the mountains right there. And above all, the youthful expression. Look at this. This is a Florentine beauty. She's a babe. And both Raphael and Leonardo captured that beautifully. And of course, Raphael then went on and used his sketch of the Mona Lisa to make one of his first commissioned paintings, the portrait of Maddalena Doni, who is obviously not longer the beauty of Lisa del Giocondo, but you can see that he completely used Lisa's position and model to create his portrait of Maddalena Doni. What happened to the early version? Well, Chris and I have been able to reconstruct what happened to it thanks to the work of a wonderful historian in Florence, Giuseppe Palanti. I must give full credit for his tremendous work. Giuseppe Palanti is a historian. He lives in Florence, and he spends his entire life in the archives of Florence. And so he is the one who has uncovered tremendously important documents that, with his permission, are in our book. And so he found, first of all, that in 1506, Leonardo secured permission to leave Florence. The great fresco of the Battle of Anghiari was falling apart for many reasons. We shall not go into that right now. Leonardo wanted to get the heck out of Florence, back to Milan, where the French wanted him. But of course, he needed the permission of the government to be able to leave, because he was under contract from the Florentine government to finish that great fresco that he so urgently wanted to paint. of course, he could not do that without the consent of the very man who got him that commission to begin with, Francesco del Giocondo. And so we believe this is why in 1506, exactly 4 years after he started it, exactly the way Vasari describes it, he delivered this portrait to Francesco del Giocondo, even though it is still unfinished exactly the way Vasari describes it. And you can see the sky is still unfinished. You can still see the gesso. The gesso is the underpaint, because the assistants, clearly after Leonardo painted the hands and the face, he left the remaining part onto his assistants, and his assistants simply hadn't gotten to the part of painting in the sky. So that is exactly why Vasari says it is unfinished. What happened then? Well, Giuseppe Pallanti found a record that in 1564, so we're talking almost 60 years, in fact, 60 years after Leonardo delivered the portrait, Francesco's grandson, Gaspari, who was known as a heavy gambler, bankrupted the company that Giocondo and his brothers had painstakingly built as a silk and wool textile firm in Florence. He blew it. He blew all his fortune. And at that point, he had to declare bankruptcy, and we have discovered the actual documents of that record the family estate being sold off. There is no actual description of the Mona Lisa, but we can certainly assume that as Gaspari had to sell off all of his holdings, a portrait that was clearly associated with Leonardo would have fetched a very nice price indeed. And that is where this lady entered her darkness, her dark years, until she was rediscovered in 1913. Okay, you might say, that sounds very interesting, but why is there a second portrait in the Louvre? Why would he then, if your theory is correct, let's assume for a moment your theory is correct, and she's only a Florentine housewife, there's nothing wrong with housewives, but you would typically make copies of a Florentine housewife and expect it to sell. A Madonna, yes. But obviously Lisa del Giocondo was not a famous person. So why would you do another version that we now see in the Louvre? And the answer is right here. And I'm showing you, obviously, reconstructions, reenactments that are being shot right now by a studio here in Santa Monica in Los Angeles called Pantheon Studios. They got the rights to our book, and they're shooting a film based on our book right now. In 1507, Leonardo found himself in a situation where he had to go back to Florence much against his will, because his half-brothers were contesting the will of his uncle Francesco. Uncle Francesco, who was childless, had given his family estate to Leonardo because he always felt bad for Leonardo as a bastard son of his father, Ser Piero. And Ser Piero's legitimate brothers contested the will. And Leonardo said, this time I'm going to fight it because I want that estate. Don't forget, Leonardo for most of his life was always in want of money. He spent all of his money on his clothes, on finery. We have lots of records in his notebooks and that of his assistants. But he never really had any fortune. And this estate was going to give him the financial stability that he wanted. And so he went back to Florence to fight the will. And good old Soderini said, aha, I have you now. And so, because they were very upset that he never finished the fresco in the Palazzo della Signoria, so Soderini delayed the trial. It was just a civic hearing. It should have taken a week or two. Because of the dealings of Soderini, the trial lasted for 6 months. So imagine this. You come down from Milan to Florence, you have clothes just for 2 weeks, your assistants, your work, your drawings, your brushes, they're all in Milan. You think you'll be back there in a few days, and instead you're marooned in Florence for 6 months. What do you do? What do you do? Well, you sort of reflect on your life. You sort of say, well, where am I going with my art? And one thing he did do was go to the hospital, the Santa Maria Nuova, which in fact held his bank account, as many religious institutions did in those days. You went to your monastery or your hospital to set up your savings account. And that's where he began to do anatomical dissections. That's where that chapter starts. And we have it recreated here. We shot this actually in the only existing anatomical theater that was actually used for such dissections in Italy, in Pistoia. And what Leonardo was after was the mystery of motherhood. That is our theory. That what he did, as he wrote himself in his notebook, I want to understand the conception of man by studying the form of the womb and how the child lives in it, to what stage it resides in it, and in which way it is given life. Throughout the Middle Ages, that was the ultimate mystery. How does a woman conceive life and give birth? Now, the church had an answer to that, and of course, that was all described in the Bible, and anyone who disagreed with that was a heretic. So if you wanted to do dissections, particularly dissections of a woman, be prepared for a barbecue party, because that's where you were going to wind up. And you were going to be the barbecue. You were going to be burned at the stake. All through the Middle Ages, there were some dissections performed. Kirsten and I detailed it in our book, but never of a woman. Never of a woman. Leonardo was the first to perform anatomical studies on a woman to decide where does life begin. And we believe that based on his anatomical studies, when he was offered a chance to go to Rome, where once again he was given a stipend, he was given the freedom to pursue whatever he wanted to do, Giuliano de' Medici being his patron, just as De Beatis told us at the beginning of my presentation, that's when he tried to capture that mystery of motherhood in a new portrait. And that became the second Mona Lisa. An allegory on the mystery of womanhood inspired by anatomical studies. And why then this strange landscape behind it that has produced such reams of ink in the scholarly literature? Well, because the creative forces of woman are echoed in that primordial landscape behind her. What we see in the background is a Genesis represented in pictorial form. And Leonardo himself gives us the clue. He writes, "A human body resembles that of the earth. As a man has in him bones, so the world has rocks." So that's our interpretation of the second Mona Lisa. That is the capture, the essence of motherhood. And you might ask, why would he use Lisa del Giocondo as his model for this beautiful, allegorical, symbolic picture of motherhood? And here's the thing that no author on Leonardo da Vinci has ever written about, and we do. Lisa del Giocondo was the same age as his own mother Caterina when she gave birth to Leonardo. We believe that what Lisa struck in Leonardo was a memory of his own mother. Don't forget, Leonardo was taken away forcefully from his mother Caterina when he was only 5 years old. And that hankering to motherly love, which he was deprived of, is the reason why we believe he could never develop the normal heterosexual attitude towards women that is so clearly evident in his notebooks and in his drawings. He saw a woman primarily as a mother figure rather than an erotic figure. And that is why we believe he went back to his sketches, his drawings, his idea of this lovely young housewife in Florence who had just given birth to create a second Mona Lisa, but now an allegorical version, a poetic tribute, if you will, to the mystery of motherhood. And you say, well, is that just your fantasy, Chris and Jean-Pierre, or do you have some evidence for it? We do have some evidence for it. Look at this very thin veil, which was only discovered after the most recent restoration of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and was confirmed by X-rays that the curatorial team of the Louvre developed. What you see there is a thin veil called a guarnello. A guarnello is a thin veil that a young woman wears when she is either pregnant or gives birth. In Florentine tradition, particularly in the late medieval and early Renaissance times, when you saw a young woman dressed in a long veil all the way to her feet, that was a clear indication she was pregnant or had just given birth. We think that the tradition goes back to the idea that as a young mother, if a young mother was found in a situation where she had to breastfeed her child in public, the guarnello gave her a sense of privacy, and over time that developed into a tradition as an attribute of pregnancy. In addition, I would like to direct your attention to this toga. Very strange. And you can see that even though the toga is to some extent present in the early version, in the Louvre version, it is far more prominent, far more developed. It is sort of a toga-like garment thrown across her left shoulder. That is an attribute of the Madonna. Throughout the Middle Ages, and particularly in Quattrocento Florence, the archaic motif of a toga thrown across the left shoulder is a clear symbol of the Virgin Mary. It appears here in the Madonna of the Yarnwinder of 1501. It appears again, as you can see, the blue toga-like garment in the depiction of Mary in his last major Madonna painting, the St. Anne trilogy. So we believe that when you look at the Mona Lisa, what we're really looking at is a motherhood motif inspired by the Madonna. If there is one motif that is consistent throughout the career of Leonardo da Vinci, it is the Madonna. Of 18 paintings, 10 are paintings of the Virgin Mary. And here I conclude my story with where we started. Why is she smiling? Well, Chris and I are going to tell you why she is smiling, because it is not at all what you might think. Why is she smiling here? Why is this St. Anne smiling there? And why is the St. John smiling in this portrait? And once again, this is where we started this presentation. Remember when the Cardinal d'Aragon and his secretary, Antonio de Beatis, traveled to Leonardo and saw 3 paintings that Leonardo insisted they should see: the Mona Lisa, the St. Anne, and the St. John. All have this mysterious smile. What does it mean? We believe it means the Redentore in Italian. What all these 3 portraits refer to is the coming of the Redeemer. John the Baptist smiles because he knows soon the Redeemer is coming. The Mona Lisa smiles because perhaps she carries the Redeemer in her womb. And St. Anne smiles because she sees the young baby Jesus, and only she knows what he will ultimately become, the Redeemer. So we believe that's why these 3 paintings were kept in Leonardo's possession until the very end of his life. That is the programmatic connection between these 3 individual paintings. And again, of 18 undisputed paintings, 10 of them depict the Virgin Mary. So obviously the Virgin Mary, perhaps because of the motherhood motif, perhaps because of his hankering for motherly love, have been the major constant throughout his career. Now you might say, that's stretching it a little bit. Let's face it. If there is one person who we know as a secularist, as someone who eschewed the church and rather pursued his own scientific observation, it is Leonardo da Vinci. He is perhaps the first secular man in Renaissance times. That may be true, But near the end of his life, Leonardo had a turnabout. In his will, he writes, I commend my soul to our Lord Almighty God and to the glorious Virgin Mary, and ask for 33 masses to be said in his memory. Vasari says, near the end of his life, Leonardo earnestly wished to learn the teachings of the Catholic faith, which that tells us that he had a turnabout. Near the end of his life, as he faced death, he went back to spiritual values that for much of his life he basically had ignored. So our conclusions, in summary, are: one, there are two Mona Lisa paintings. The first version was discovered, again, in 2012, predating the Louvre version by at least 6 years. Leonardo was coerced to paint this portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, even though he didn't want to paint any portraits. He didn't want to even touch the brush, because it was the quid pro quo for Francesco del Giocondo, Lisa's husband, to get him the large fresco contract from the city of Florence. We also believe that this earlier version was sold out of the Giocondo family after Gaspari, Francesco's grandson, was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1564, and it only reappeared in 1913 when it was discovered by Hugh Blakener, and now in 2012. And finally, that we believe that the second version of the Mona Lisa, now in the Louvre, was painted during Leonardo's stay in Rome. That's why Leonardo refers to it as being painted under the behest, under the patronage, if you will, of Giuliano de' Medici, and that she is an allegorical depiction of motherhood inspired by the motif of the Madonna Annunziata, the Virgin Mary following her conception by the Holy Spirit. Those are the conclusions of our book, The Mona Lisa Myth. Thank you so much for coming here today, and Chris and I will be delighted to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
One thing I'd like to add, Colby, is you have to realize that in these two paintings that Giorgio Vasari never saw this painting. This was in France. He never went to France. He never saw this. He saw this one. It wasn't painted on wood like all of other Da Vinci paintings, original paintings were done. It was painted on canvas. So when Blake first brought this out, and it's painted on canvas, and there's even an art scholar now who says, well, Da Vinci didn't paint on canvas. Maybe it is a copy. Puts a lot of question, and I think Blake had to deal with that in that period of time. I think it makes perfect sense. We alluded to it in the book that it was painted on canvas and only in 5 layers, because it was the silk merchant's wife, so it was canvas. It was a silky type product that he was painting on. But number 2, it wasn't as expensive, and this was for just a Florentine wife. Versus this painting, which is painted in 30 layers, but it actually has a very deeper depth. It's the coating that's put on the top of it. The varnish is darkened over the years, and there's questions on what they're going to do as far as restoring the Mona Lisa. But at some point, it was probably as vibrant as this Mona Lisa. But 30 layers of paint. He put so much more time and dedication into something that meant a lot to him, and why he carried it around his whole life. And it makes perfect sense that she's the Virgin Mary. This painting is really not finished, and the Vasari accounts, even for Blake in that period of time, probably put a lot of questions as to what is this? And there's so many copies of the Mona Lisa. I think he just got frustrated and said, I'm going to put it away, and at a later date, kind of like what's going on with the Kennedy assassination, and we know so much more about what happened during that period of time than we did historically right after it happened. This is the perfect time for this whole story to be told, and I think we really captured it in our book.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Why do you think in the later version he decided not to do the same glow in the skin? Was that just something that was a motif in his later work? I think you mentioned that earlier. That
Yes.
supposed to still have the glow of motherhood, you would imagine, right? But it's so different between the two.
a lot of authors have commented on the fact that the face of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre version is no longer the face of a likeness. It's no longer a real likeness of a living person. It is a composite. Some people have even gone so far as to say that it's a composite part of Leonardo's own face. And so, whereas the earlier version is really a likeness of a real person, there he tried to create an allegorical ideal of what his ideal idea of a mother would look like. And there it is somewhat belabored, if you will. And that's why, as Chris said, he used over 30 different glazes, the layers, to constantly look for the absolute ideal of motherhood for him personally. I mean, again, we think very strongly he harked back to his mother, Caterina, and perhaps it's true that there is something of his own facial resemblance in there, because perhaps he looked like his mother, Caterina. So that's why we think that the face looks a bit strange, because it is a sort of a montage, if you will, of many different sentiments and aspirations.
But the varnish has definitely affected that feel that we get here.
Yes.
If this was to be restored or cleansed, or if that varnish had never darkened, I think we would get more of the feel that we get on the left. You got to realize, though, this canvas, it's been protected, like JP said. This was been in the bathroom of France.
That's right.
Francois.
Yeah.
It's been in Napoleon's bedroom. It's been in and out of the Louvre. It has much more cracking. It's on wood, which is actually cracked and been restored. So this has, been tortured by the atmosphere much more so than this pristine, vaulted product here. We don't know what happened in the 16th, 17th, 18th century and how that was protected. But this, she's been through a lot. And she's never left France. Vasari never saw this painting.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate. That I cannot think of many other artists, with the exception of Vincent van Gogh, who gave us such a large literary body as well as a creative aesthetic body. So what we have here is a vast corpus of notebooks that, for Chris and I, have been a tremendous guide throughout writing our book. And it's clear from those notebooks that he was reluctant. I mean, there was a fatigue of the brush, as one eyewitness referred to it, when he painted the portrait. He did it extremely reluctantly. And we think that he probably didn't think more of it. Look, I'll throw together the face and the hands and hand it off to my assistants and never think about it again. But when he saw Lisa del Giocondo in the flesh, this beautiful young mother, glowing with motherhood, as young mothers do, it really struck him. It really resonated with him. And in the end of his life, as he returned, came back to a more spiritual orientation, that image came to haunt him. And that is what we think he wanted to capture. And yes, she is far more matronly. When you look at the Louvre Mona Lisa, there is no way this can be a portrait of a 24-year-old girl. This is not a woman in her. This is a matronly woman. And again, that's all related to the concept of motherhood, the ideal of motherhood. Yeah, so we totally agree with the way you phrase it. That's exactly what we argue here. Sir.
You mentioned that this one was signed, the one with the columns is signed by Leonardo?
I'm sorry?
I think you mentioned that the one with the columns is signed by Leonardo. Is it signed?
It's not signed, no.
Oh, it's
not signed, no. Virtually none, there is one exception, but virtually none of Leonardo's works are dated, titled, or signed. And again, we think he did that on purpose, to create that mystique. And I think that's why today people are so fascinated with Leonardo, because he is not an open book. And anyone can go out and throw out crazy theories, as people have been doing about the Mona Lisa for the last 40 years. What Chris and I try to do is say, look, let's take the scholarly evidence, let's take connoisseurship, let's take basically whatever information we have, and of course we were helped by many new discoveries over the last couple of years, and let's really reconstruct the chronology from the very beginning till the very end of how this project came about. And so while we don't have a signature, unfortunately, we think this is about as close to the actual series of events that we can possibly get. Yes, go ahead.
So the painting disappeared in the vault for a number of years. How does that happen? I mean, does the owner just forget that they have Leonardo, or did she
me how.
No, I mean, there are many things. Of course, Pulitzer, I read his book, and it's a very tormented book, a very unhappy book, and it was completely ignored by scholarship. But what it does show is that he sort of felt slighted and insulted, and said, well, maybe there is a sense of, well, if you don't like it, then you can have it, type of a thing. In addition, there were lots of financial questions, financial issues he was facing. When he died, of course, the estate was in uproar. I mean, can you imagine getting an autographed Leonardo that would be worth $100 million? You don't let that hang in your house, you know. And so there is a sense of, let's keep it in a vault. When the right time comes, we're going to rediscover it. We're going to, you know, do all the things we need to do it. But at the same time, of course, you also face tremendous questions about autograph authorship. And I don't think either Pulitzer or his partner, who inherited the painting after he died, had the courage to confront the skepticism of Leonardo scholarship, which is extremely confrontational sometimes. I mean, people write nasty things about each other if you know the art historical literature. And I don't think, you have to have a very thick skin. And we're delighted that this particular foundation that finally took over has that thick skin, that they have the caliber to say, okay, shoot your arrows. And obviously we're supportive of much of what they're saying. There's some areas minor areas where we disagree, but we are delighted that finally there is a group of people who are saying, okay, we're going to put all the tests through it, and we've had spectral analysis of this painting, we've had carbon dating of this painting, we've had X-rays of this painting by I forget in Paris, that will come to me in a second. The most accredited Institute of Digital Scanning, digital research on old masters.
Is that Maurizio Saraceni?
No, not Maurizio Saraceni. No, we're in touch with him too. No, it will come to me in a second. It'll come to me, Michael Coate, but he has a lab. Yes. In any case, yes, Lumiere. Thank you, Chris. Lumiere. He subjected the canvas to a rigorous barrage and came away saying, it's carbon dating, 1501. I mean, exactly when we say this project started. John Asmus, who is a nuclear physicist who used IBM technology to basically authenticate every Rembrandt on the globe, has both analyzed the Louvre Mona Lisa and the earlier version. We interviewed him just 3 weeks ago. He lives in San Diego. He says, no question, both are autographs. But you need stamina, you need financial stamina, and you need moral courage to confront that. And I don't think Pulitzer had it, quite frankly. Thank you. Sir.
How do you validate when you have that period of dealing, when you break it down and investigate, and you know the pigment and you know the materials and everything there, but when you're dealing with authenticity or ownership, the artist's ownership of it, when you work with apprentices who work with you for years and years, not like they do one like today, they were masters in their own. So was there any variation on brushstrokes on either one of these paintings that was concerned when they looked at it?
I'm very glad you asked that question because I forgot to refer to it. John Asmus, who in the 1970s, using IBM technology, digital imaging, which is just coming up, with the Louvre did a 2-year study of the Louvre Mona Lisa. Just in the last couple of years, he's done the same with the earlier version. I have him on tape saying the brushstrokes are identical. The pigments are similar, but of course they would not be the same because there is at least a 10-year lag between the two, and in the process Leonardo was always creating new mixtures and always experimenting with his oils, so they would not be the same. But the philosophy of starting with a gesso, an under gesso, an upper gesso, and then working your way to the final composite through glazes of oils is exactly the same. Yeah.
One of the comments I'd like to make is there is another painting that's very commonly compared to the Louvre Mona Lisa called the Prado Mona Lisa. And the Prado Mona Lisa may or may not have been painted by Sala. It's very similar, except the background, especially the mountain ranges, look significantly different. And some people think it was painted about the same time that Da Vinci was painting this one, in the 1508 to 1512 time period. That painting looks so much like this, but nothing like the Vasari account. And the Vasari account matches this painting. Vasari also lived several houses down or stone streets away from Lisa Giocondo. So he would have actually seen this painting and no possibility of seeing Salai's painting of the Prado Mona Lisa. So there's no chance that the Prado Mona Lisa, looking much like this Mona Lisa, would have been the same account that Vasari would have been making.
Sheila, you had a question for the longest time. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's right. Well, I mean, I know she's a mystery, but I was wondering what was known about her social class and why a young mother would have been wearing such somber clothes.
Oh, that's a good question. It was when a young girl married, she was expected to bear children very, very soon. And so it was considered to be quite glamorous to wear dark. And for us, dark has a connotation, dark clothes, black clothes have a connotation with mourning. It was quite the opposite in the 16th century, and particularly in the 17th century in Holland, where black became a symbol of wealth. Don't forget, her husband was a silk merchant. Black silk is extremely expensive. One thing that, and we write in the book, one thing that we always have to be careful of as historians is to project our own zeitgeist on the works that we're analyzing. And we've seen a lot of historians, some of the very good historians, often do that, when they project their own assumptions. For example, related to Leonardo's homosexuality. Just because somebody may have gay inclinations in our world means that he also practices in that sense. Not in the 15th century, 16th century. Leonardo clearly did not have the same heterosexual inclinations that you would expect from a man. He drew many nudes of men, but it doesn't really mean at the same time that he was also a practicing gay person. And that's so often the mistake that people make. Historians, even in our own lifetime, our contemporaries who write about Leonardo, immediately make that jump. And the same with our fashion. So what to us seems very somber clothing was in the 16th century actually a mark of great distinction. That's why, for example, in the 17th century, Dutch masters, they're all wearing black, you know. Of course, that had something to do with the Lutheran religion as well, but you could get away with wearing very flashy clothes in 17th century Holland as long as it was black. And so it was a mark of great distinction. Jan.
Even though Leonardo habitually painted multiples of some of his paintings, and that there are some obvious sort of conflicts in the histories of the Mona Lisa painting, do you think that there is a refusal among art experts just to accept the idea even of another Mona Lisa? Well,
several art historians over the last 40 years, when the Mona Lisa topic really became hot, have speculated on the fact. I mean, we're not the first ones who say maybe these records are all in contradiction because they're not talking about the same painting. You know, we've had at least one or two art historians say, even Kenneth Clark, maybe there is another one. Nobody's actually made the connection to the Isleworth Mona Lisa. The other side of the coin is that a lot of historians, including Martin Kemp, put their reputation on a certain interpretation of the Mona Lisa. And so some very fine historians over the last 40 years have said, she's not Del Giocondo, she is Isabella d'Este or somebody else. It's very difficult to accept in scholarship that you're wrong. I mean, we don't want to be told we're wrong in everyday life. But if you've written a book about it and it's out there in the marketplace, in the libraries, and the university libraries, and now it turns out you were wrong, that's a very tough nut to crack. And so that's why there's a natural reluctance, not just in the field of art history, in virtually every field. People sometimes are proven wrong, just like this Heidelberg document of 2005. Who would have known if this German professor hadn't been working on this strange exhibit to which maybe two people and a dog would have appeared, right? If he hadn't been working on this obscure exhibit of the works of Cicero published in the 15th century, he would have never come across this little stupid little annotation in the margin, and yet it has revolutionized what we know about the Mona Lisa. Things like that are uncomfortable. And who knows, maybe 5 years from now, somebody else will be standing here with an entirely different theory. And that's fine. That's how knowledge and human knowledge advances. So I think that's why there is sometimes a bit of a reluctance to say, I was wrong.
Have you ever heard that it was stolen and returned at any time in its history?
Not the earlier version. As you know, the Louvre version in 1911 was stolen by an Italian who thought it rightfully belonged to the Italian nation. That's what he told the press. Really what he was trying to do is sell it back to the Uffizi for 500,000 lire, which then was a lot of money. A few years ago it wasn't, but then it was a lot of money. And so, yes, it was stolen. It was lost for 2 years. And many people thought that they would never see the Mona Lisa again. I mean, if you read the newspapers from that time, this was just before World War I, people said, my God, this great painting, it's lost, right? And then, of course, it was found under his bed in a flea-bag, one-star hotel in Florence the day before he was going to take it to the Uffizi for a check of 500,000 lire and returned to Italy. Yeah, so that really created that whole notoriety. That's when she became a megastar. Yes.
An icon.
That's right. Yeah.